Okay, so today's topic is brand standing, big brands and Black Lives Matter. And we're going to talk about what happened in with after we're going to talk about the killing of George Floyd and brands' responses to that. So, as a lot of people know, the tragic killing of George Floyd happened, and after that, it caused shockwaves throughout society. So, a cascade of online activity, and this was both directed at brands and demanded of brands. So, for this report, we're going to talk about the way that brands responded to this and the way that brands saw this as a challenge and the way that brands actually made positive changes. So, initially, this first topic is just more broadly about social justice and corporate social responsibility. And for a long time, corporate social responsibility was seen as an optional thing. Brands maybe didn't have to do it, and it was something that was tacked on at the end. It wasn't something that was embedded throughout the organization. But now, increasingly, we're seeing that brands need to be corporate, need to be socially responsible if they want to do well. Um, Social responsibility is corporate social responsibility encompasses the environment, philanthropy, ethical labor practices, social and workplace equity. All of these things are ways that brands can actually be responsible and be good members of society. Uh, and in the past, this often was just offsetting negative impacts that businesses had. So a lot of airlines will offset the carbon footprint that they create, and that's seen as a form of corporate social responsibility. But it's very different to what we're seeing now, where it's not just about offsetting the things that you've done wrong, but it's about being right and being a leader in society, which is quite a change. The previous example, the previous quote was from Milton Friedman, a very famous economist, talking about how the only responsibility of brands is to make profit, and the shareholders are the only stakeholders that a brand should care about. But as we see now, it's not just that. This here is a quote from Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. He's probably the most successful banker in modern times, and you can see by his statement, he says that JP Morgan are committed to fighting against racism and discrimination wherever and however it exists. So this isn't just something that's tacked on at the end. It's not something that you just fix the wrongs, but it's about doing right and being a good member of society. So that's the change that we're seeing. Uh, this slide here, you see the ways that corporations, and Nike is probably the most famous example of that, where they have fully embraced this idea of being a good corporate, being a good citizen and being somebody that's prepared. And I say somebody because it very is personified. People, brands are people in this situation. Brands are not competing just on their products, but they're competing on their ethics and their morals. So you can see in the statistics here that maybe there isn't a choice anymore about between being socially responsible, being committed to social justice, and being rewarded, and choosing between that or greater growth or profit, because brands are increasingly seeing that if you have a purpose, you're going to be more successful, you're going to have greater growth, you're going to have see bigger profits. It isn't a choice anymore, and especially for younger consumers, where 83% of millennials find it important for companies they buy from to align with their values. So consumers are very value driven now. It's not just about products anymore. So this is a poll, a recent poll, some statistics about what chief marketing officers at brands think. And you can see that now more than ever, and this was in February, so before the protests and before this changed society in such a big way, brands were already seeing that they saw that taking a stance on politically charged issues is the right thing to do, and they do that out of not just being wanting to be better, but seeing it as the way to make the most profit. That's the way that you're going to be successful. That's the way you're going to appeal to the most consumers. So now we're moving on to public opinion. What does the public think about what brands should or shouldn't do? One thing's for certain, staying silent isn't an option. You can't just ignore this. It's something that you're going to have to respond to. And among the world's top brands, at 70 or 80% of them have responded to this on social media. And make no mistake that social media is the place where all of this happens, where you make a statement or you publicize your efforts, and people will either criticize you or support you. And that's going to manifest not just in sales, but in boycott campaigns on social media, as Nike experienced and many companies experience. But making no official statement isn't an option. So then what is the option? What should brands do? Should they support the police? Should they support protesters? Those are two options. And as you can see, they're quite divisive amongst different groups, but those aren't the only options. You can take action, and that action can be internal. You can address some of the issues within your company, and consumers on the whole see that as one of the most positive things you can do beyond just making a statement. So public opinion, consumers are actually very cynical about this. They don't necessarily think that companies mean what they say. They think that companies are only doing this maybe because they want to retain customers, which is interesting because making no statement was seen as the worst option. But if you do make a statement, on the whole, the majority of consumers might not believe you. So how can you show that you're actually committed to making a statement that means something, that there's actually something behind your words? These are the things that you need to consider as a brand. Does your brand have a history of supporting social justice? That's something that some companies are very well established with, the likes of Ben & Jerry's, Patagonia, more recently Nike. Is there a measurable way of quantifying your response? Is there a financial incentive? Is there a financial commitment? Is your workforce diverse? And then finally, is your exec team diverse? And some of the campaigns that we'll be touching on in this presentation actually address the heart of some of these concerns. So firstly, we're going to start with one campaign that didn't go well, the Blackout Tuesday campaign. And this campaign began, let's talk about what it was first. So the Blackout Tuesday initiative was a way for brands to show their support for the Black Lives Matter movement, to show their solidarity with the movement by posting a black square on social media, which doesn't sound like the most meaningful thing. And that's the way a lot of people saw it. A lot of consumers and a lot of activists saw this as purely performative, virtue signaling at its most blatant, because there wasn't actually any goals attached to this. There wasn't any financial contribution. There wasn't any action taken on behalf of the company other than posting this image on social media. That wasn't the way it started. This began with the music industry specifically, and two black execs within the industry, calling on the music industry to actually reflect on the role that they've had in profiting from and at times exploiting black artists. And that goes back to another point. Think about your brand and what the profile of your brand is. Music brands, some specific consumer brands, the likes of Red Bull, for example, has engaged in many activities, many sponsorships with urban communities. Those kinds of things are things to consider when you really want to make a statement or take some action. Think about who are your audience. So this started off as something that could potentially have been meaningful, but the way it was twisted and what eventually happened was it just became black boxes. That's all it was, really. And a lot of people saw it as that. And actually, some people saw it as harming the movement because they saw it as silencing genuine concerns and genuine forms of activism that some other brands were taking part in. This is something that brands have to constantly be vigilant for. Being called out on social media, is something that happens to almost every brand nowadays, but it's more likely to happen when certain people are triggered in certain ways. So the kinds of triggers that can prompt people to come out with their stories of genuine mistreatment and harassment or experiences of racism in the workplace are when a brand makes a statement and they're publicly praised and people don't see the other side of it. So that's what happened in this case here, where this former employee of Milk Makeup. Milk Makeup is a well-known makeup brand who have had a long-standing commitment to being a progressive company. And in response to this pull up or shut up campaign, which I'll talk about more later in this presentation, but to sum up, it was just a campaign where companies were pressured to release their diversity statistics. Again, going back to that question, is your company diverse? Is the exec team diverse? They were not very diverse, but they said that they would address this. They recognized this as an issue. And people generally praised them for that because they were being honest about what they needed to do and where they needed to improve. But this former employee saw that as actually not being a genuine commitment because of the experiences she had faced. And that's something that a lot of former Nike employees as well talked about when Nike came out with their response and were universally praised by many people. But people within the company saw this as not being consistent with their experiences as Black employees at Nike. So being vigilant for these, and often these posts are anonymous. People don't want to lose their jobs if they're current employees, and they have a real potential to harm the brand. So that specific post from the former Milk Makeup employee got over 18,000 likes. This Instagram account, Black at Nike, got over 10,000 followers in a short space of time. Now, other campaigns. So as I mentioned, Pull Up or Shut Up, this began on June the 3rd, the day after Blackout Tuesday, by a Black executive in the makeup industry. And she called it Pull Up or Shut Up because she gave brands a deadline, 72 hours, to release their internal diversity figures. Is their workforce diverse? But more specifically, is their exec team diverse? So this again goes back to the wider point that to be seen as truly doing something, even if imperfect, you have to take action rather than making statements. So the response to this was actually very positive. A lot of big brands, beauty brands, this was specifically targeting the beauty brands, although it did extend beyond that. But beauty brands, a lot of them released their figures, and many of them weren't up to what they should have been. Especially, they weren't representative of a wider society. But brands were universally praised for this because they were allowing themselves to be held accountable. They were being transparent with their audience, with consumers, and they weren't shying away from these difficult conversations that need to be had. But at the same time, they were being held accountable on social media, and people created, if brands didn't respond to these commitments, here there's an example in the slide of Zara who didn't respond to this pressure, and they were condemned as silent brands, and that's worse than not having figures that match up to representative figures across your company, but actually not responding to this and ignoring it is seen as far worse than that. Something else that began in the aftermath was this initiative, the 15% pledge, and it's got 60,000 followers on Instagram. It's very popular at this point, and it's got a lot of support. And this pledge is asking retailers to commit 15% of their shelf space to Black-owned businesses. And this is an example of businesses being asked to take action and not just pressure society, not just talk about what they're doing, but pressure their suppliers and their partners to actually take part in these initiatives together. And that's got support from Sephora and Rent the Runway, for example, have actually got on board with this initiative so far. And then finally, I want to talk about the way that spreadsheets are being utilized now. Spreadsheets in the past maybe have just been used by accountants or market analysts, but now public spreadsheets are increasingly being used to crowdsource information. Companies are being questioned on criteria. It's being listed for the public to see, and it's all in one easily accessible place. And these spreadsheets are being spread across social media for a variety of causes. Black Lives Matter and anti-racism is just one of them, but there's a lot of examples of this. So the final campaign that I want to look at is something that's tangentially related to Black Lives Matter. It's not exclusively related to Black Lives Matter, but that was a big driving factor behind this. So what was the Stop Hate for Profit campaign? You may know of it as you may have heard about the Facebook boycott. That's essentially what this was. And the media was reporting it as a single thing, although in reality, as we'll discuss, it was actually a variety of boycotts or pauses. Brands were very inconsistent in the way that they described what they were doing here. So let's talk about the campaign first. The campaign actually made some very specific recommendations to the platform, to Facebook. Facebook was seen as a platform that allowed hate, racism, anti-Semitism to flourish. And Facebook generates a lot of ad revenue from the content on their platform. 99% of Facebook's revenue comes from advertising. So this campaign wanted to hit them where it counts, and that is their advertising revenue. So as mentioned, this gave brands an opportunity to put their money where their mouth is. They were being afforded the opportunity to not just take internal action, but also pressure their partners and do something beyond their products, because this was something that this again goes back to the idea of being not just socially responsible, but being an advocate for social justice. Maybe misinformation and hate doesn't directly affect the brands, but if brands are supporting content that's appearing near that kind of information on a platform that allows that information to spread, this harms society at large, not just the brands. So interest in this was widespread. So that's Google search interest there. It peaked just before July, but here we have the Facebook. On the line you see there is the Facebook share price, and then you see the bars are the actual total mentions for the hashtag Stop Hate for Profit. So you can see this caused a major impact, at least in the short term. And Facebook was a major part, and Facebook online conversations actually clearly corresponded with the impact that Facebook took. So you can see that on June the 19th, the first major brand joined this. So that was the North Face. The North Face is well known for advocating for social justice. That's been a part of their brand since the very start. And then on June the 26th, a number of other brands joined this. So Unilever, Verizon, Coca-Cola, all joined this boycott, or their own form of a boycott in one way or another. And then on June the 27th, Facebook actually responded to this, and they announced some changes to their policies around hate, but this fell short of the actual changes being demanded of them by the campaign. So in response to that, Starbucks, Ford, Adidas, among others, actually joined the campaign after that. So that wasn't a very successful response. And you can see that Facebook took almost a 9% hit in its share price. And that aligns perfectly with when these hashtags, these tweets were being most used. So these are the early movers here. We looked at the companies that had committed to a advertising pause. Not all of them aligned themselves with the Stop Hate for Profit campaign. The early ones, these examples, so some of the very clear purpose-driven brands, the likes of North Face, Patagonia, Ben and Jerry's, and even some more general brands like Levi's and Honda, aligned themselves clearly with this campaign. And that's something that many brands after June 27th didn't actually do. These brands didn't align themselves with the campaign. They said they were pausing advertising, and some of them did that only on Facebook. Some of that did it across social media. Some of them did it for July. Some of them did it beyond, but they weren't actually aligning themselves with the Stop Hate for Profit campaign. Although, as you can see in both of these slides, the campaign credited every single one of these brands. So that shows you that sometimes action is enough, even if your statement isn't perfect, and even if your goals are not as outlined as they should be or as demanded to be. Sometimes taking that action, you will get credit for taking the action. These are statements from some of the brands taking part. Verizon, they stated that they were taking part in this pause, but they weren't actually boycotting. Unilever said a similar thing, that they're not part of the boycott, and they have a long-term relationship with Facebook, but they don't want their brands to appear on the news feed, on the very toxic near the very toxic conversations that are going on. That's another point that should be noted, that social media, hate, racism, misinformation, all impact brands, even if not directly being spread by brands, but appearing near that kind of information and having sponsored content, especially near that, is harmful to brands. So on the whole, this was received very positively. People credited the brands for taking part. And while some people did see this as an attempt at censorship, you cannot be surprised by alienating a small number of people if you take a bold stance. And that's something that brands have seen across the board. Nike, when they signed up Colin Kaepernick to their campaign, they faced a significant amount of backlash from people who saw him as being disrespectful to the flag. And you saw social media campaigns, boycott Nike, people burning their trainers. But you have to be prepared to take a bold stance and weather any impact and alienating anybody from that by that. So brand pressure on the whole came in this instance from a lot of celebrities. There was a lot of grassroots support, but you can see that these companies were all being pressured together, and companies that didn't take part in this actually have seen some criticism for being seen to be lagging behind the rest of the competition. And that's a key point of competition nowadays for brands. If it's not just about your products, but if a competitor is seen as a more ethical option, then you may lose out on those grounds rather than having a better product. Or in many cases, products are very, very similar, and consumers are looking at new ways to differentiate between good and bad. So some of the key takeaways from this is that corporate social responsibility, while important and while it has played its part, is perhaps somewhat outdated. Corporate social justice, advocating for good in society beyond just what's relevant to your consumers or your products, is a way that brands are going to be challenged in the future. And that challenge is going to come from social media. You are going to face criticism if you are not making these kinds of statements, if you aren't taking part in these campaigns, and consumers will boycott you or will advocate against you online. So also, as mentioned, you have to be prepared to alienate some consumers. You can't please everybody. You have to be aware of that when making statements. Some brands have tried to do that. Pepsi tried to do that with their ad a few years ago, and that where they showed a nondescript protest and they used Kendall Jenner as the ambassador in that. But that attempt of unifying people and glossing over some of the real issues in society was widely condemned, and that's something that a lot of brands have learned from in recent years. So virtue signaling is something that could be the worst of the worst situation is a brand that's seen as virtue signaling, because they will not gain credit from the group that they're trying to gain credit from, people who care about, say, social justice and these causes, but at the same time they will face criticism from the opposing side. So that can be seen as the worst case scenario, where, and that's something that the Blackout Tuesday movement, the Blackout Tuesday campaign fell into for many brands. The Stop Hate for Profit campaign, on the other hand, was widely viewed as favorable because the demands here were specific, actionable. People could see this having a real impact on Facebook, and brands were putting their money where their mouth is. They weren't just making a statement, but they were actually doing something to back it up. Brands who paused advertising actually got a very positive response from social media users. So that's something to consider, that sometimes taking a stand on social media, even against some social media platforms in this example, is something that may prove popular if you're trying to be a good corporate citizen and advocate for social justice throughout society. And then beyond that, these are just some recommendations for brands when they're thinking about how to go about this, how to make statements, what to watch out for, and how to monitor the aftermath of some of these statements and these campaigns. Thank you, everybody. Any questions will be welcome. Happy to answer anything. If anybody has any, so we've got a question. So smaller brands. So the question is, what do I think smaller brands and businesses can do to have an impact? Smaller brands certainly haven't faced the same pressure as large brands. In some of those statistics that I pulled earlier from CMOs, something like 40-something% of CMOs at companies with revenue over 44 billion, over $10 billion, felt pressure, were willing to put their brand on, to take a stance on these social issues. But actually, brands with revenue between $1 and $9.9 billion, no CMOs were actually willing to take an impact, make an impact there, but to take a stance on a social issue. But there's still plenty of ways, but those are not necessarily small brands. Those are, let's say, medium enterprises. But small brands actually have a very targeted niche audience often. So if you have an audience that it's not like a consumer brand like Nike, for example, where you have to appeal to as many people as possible, but you've got a very specific targeted audience, and you will know about who your consumers are, and taking action, and beyond just making statements, but actually taking action and encouraging diversity across your workplace and showing support for actual philanthropic causes related to the movement will be a way that your brand can actually show support without being accused of virtue signaling. Another question. Okay, so how often should brands post about these topics compared to other topics in the social media posts? Well, we've seen that actually one thing that some brands have found to be helpful is showing a long track record of support. If you're just responding in the aftermath of an event, of a traumatic event such as George Floyd's killing, then you're going to be seen as having jumped on the bandwagon. But if you are consistently posting about things and actually showing support, as some brands like Patagonia, North Face, Ben and Jerry's have seen, if you make this part of your brand and you show a real commitment to social justice beyond these traumatic events, then you will be credited by people. So I don't think there's necessarily a risk of being seen as insincere and virtue signaling if you make that a part of your day-to-day operations of the brand, rather than just doing it in response in a reactive way. So a specific example, a question here about how brands' actions on the subject may have negatively or positively impacted product sales. I've not seen any specific examples in this current month or so, a few months or so since this happened, but you can see the way that, if I've got some statistics about Nike, actually. Nike, in the aftermath of signing up Colin Kaepernick to their campaign in 2017, online sales went up by 60%, online conversations about the brand were up 50 times, and overall sales were up something like 25% in the week after they did that. So clearly these actions have, and that was at a time when it was seen as far more risky. The Black Lives Matter movement didn't have the same kind of support that it has now. So I would imagine that you're seeing a similar impact for brands that have taken a clear stance in recent weeks, recent months, as you did see back then, and perhaps to a greater extent. Thank you for your questions. Feel free to send more over. Cool. Okay. Thank you everyone for attending. It was great talking to you about this topic. I hope people found it informative.